We have a dangerous ambulance shortage in this city.
The level of service based on other cities is as good as any city, if not better.
This is Chicago Tonight, Tuesday, September 1st, 1998.
Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Brackett, sitting in for John Calloway. When you call a Chicago Fire Department ambulance, how long will it take to arrive? Two recent investigations, one by the Chicago Tribune, the other by the Better Government Association, say it often takes too long. Critics point to some cases where it's taken more than 20 minutes for help to arrive. The national standard is 4 to 6 minutes. But the city says the average response time for an ambulance is just over 6 minutes. How well is Chicago doing? Does the city have enough ambulances? We'll hear from both sides right after this background report from WBEZ's Shirley Jihad.
If you or a loved one are in need of an ambulance, minutes may seem like hours, and every moment counts. Illinois state public health officials are looking into whether Chicago ambulances are dangerously slow to respond. Critics are turning up the heat, saying Chicago's emergency medical service is inadequate.
Everyone's life is at risk because the system is so unbelievably haphazard in the city of Chicago.
But you're saying
you're playing Russian roulette with your life every time you call 911.
Ambulance response times are supposed to be 4 to 6 minutes, according to national and state standards. But critics say the clock runs longer than that in more than 15% of the runs. In some cases, more than 20 minutes go by. The Better Government Association uses the case of Christopher Searcy, the boy who lay shot and bleeding outside Ravenswood Hospital, as one example of thousands of times each year when they say emergency response is too slow.
Chicago Emergency School.
I called you 2 minutes ago and I asked to send somebody with the ambulance. Man, why did it take so long time, please? He's not over there. This child will die.
Christopher's mother says help didn't come fast enough to save her son's life.
What I was told by the doctor was that Chris had lost a lot of blood. So that's an emergency.
Where's the ambulance? The people inside are saying, where's the ambulance? The police are saying, where's the ambulance? Everybody's saying, where's the ambulance? I mean, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. They didn't come through.
Many critics say the problem with long response times stems from a severe shortage of ambulances. And they say Chicago has fewer ambulances per capita than most big cities across the country. Brunner points to hundreds of ambulance run sheets over the past several months where response times were clocked too high. He says 911 dispatchers simply try to stall and screen callers when ambulances just aren't available.
When there isn't an ambulance immediately available, they give you the runaround. This is called the runaround.
But Chicago fire officials disagree.
Based on the figures that we have now, we feel relatively confident that we have enough ambulances on the street. If I didn't feel confident in it, why wouldn't I raise my hand and say, Mayor, we need more ambulances? I mean, they're not coming out of my pocket.
Congressman Bobby Rush, a likely mayoral candidate, says race plays a role in response time.
There's a great disparity and a great unfairness in the way the ambulances are dispatched, and therefore the response times for ambulance services is much greater on the south side than it is on the north side and other parts of the city.
I have loved ones in this city. I have family in this city. I live in this city. And I am not concerned about any of my family or myself or your family or any of the citizens in this city picking up the phone and calling 911 and getting immediate emergency medical service.
Fire officials say instead of buying more ambulances, they're beefing up emergency response by rigging fire engines with medical supplies and personnel. The souped-up fire trucks are called advanced life support engines.
That engine has a paramedic and an EMT on it, the same that's required for any ambulance anywhere in the state to be advanced life support. So that means that when they arrive on the scene, they can give the same care and treatment that that paramedic arriving in the ambulance can give.
But the advanced life support engines are not equipped to carry the injured to hospitals. They just help stabilize patients. The injured still have to wait for ambulances to transport them to hospital emergency rooms.
Field services discouraged by the fire departments on manual, their own Bible, their own standard, their own operating procedures here.
But fire officials say the effort is part of a larger move to drastically change how their department operates. They want firefighters to also do the work of paramedics, and 10% of each new firefighter class will be made up of paramedics.
Well, the advantage is a real big advantage, because if you've got an individual that's capable of being on the fire side and the EMS side, today he might be on the engine, tomorrow he might be on the ambulance, the following day he might be on the hook and ladder.
The number of fires is down. Officials say 3 times as many 911 calls involve medical emergencies rather than fires. In the meantime, city officials insist a new management study due out next year will help determine how to best use the fire department's resources. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Shirley Jihad.
And now joining us to discuss ambulance response time are Cortez Trotter, Deputy Fire Commissioner of the Chicago Fire Department. Dr. Glushak. Dr. Glushak is the Medical Director of the University of Chicago's Emergency Medical Systems and Chairman of the EMS Medical Directors Consortium of Chicago. Terrence Brunner, Executive Director of the Better Government Association. And Patrick Fitzmaurice, a Chicago Fire Department paramedic officer from the Austin District and the Union Steward. Welcome all of you to Chicago Tonight. Well, Mr. Trotter, there are some pretty tough complaints in the piece that we saw. And the city's basic response seems to me, let's send a fire truck, and that will provide the same type of care as an ambulance. Tell us why that is.
Well, the city's response, I think, if we take that question, Elizabeth, and pose it like this, should the citizens of Chicago, the people in Chicago, receive the best possible trained personnel at the scene of their cardiac, medical, or trauma emergency as quickly as we can possibly get them there? The answer to that is yes. The fundamental difference here that we believe that our critics obviously seem to disagree with is that that's not solely done through the use of ambulances. There are other avenues available to us. Our belief is to use the resources that we have at our disposal to get a trained paramedic and the same type of advanced life support equipment that's found on our ambulances to the side of this patient as quickly as possible. It's not only responsible, efficient, and practical, but it's prudent.
Mr. Fitzmaurice, you're the paramedic here tonight. Does that make sense to you? Is it as safe and as efficient and practical?
Oh, in our opinion, it's an excellent backup system. It's a redundant backup because there are going to be times when you can't get an ambulance there. But the reality of the situation is fire trucks can't transport. In many of our situations now, trauma, cardiac situations, complications in pregnancy, these people need rapid treatment and transportation. The acute asthma patient, there's just so much you can do in the ambulance, and our priority now is to rapidly assess the patient, rapidly treat them, and rapidly get them to the hospital. Our own standard medical operating procedures even state many times to treat while you're going to the hospital. And the other problem is, as you have firefighters responding to these calls, you're taking them away from their main mission of fire suppression and rescue. There have been many instances, for instance, in the 13th Battalion, where we have 3 ALS engines, and they're all committed to an ambulance run, and now we have a fire. Well, who's going to take the fire? And, you know, fire calls may be down, but they're still devastating, and you still need to get firemen there as fast and as quickly as possible.
Well, let's take those points one at a time. First, let me come back to you, Mr. Trotter. As a respond to his first point, that what you really need is to get these people to the hospital as quickly as possible, and a fire truck can't do that.
True. In some cases, I think the word that Pat used was rapid. Now, rapid certainly is something that we agree with. However, there is still an amount of time that it takes to stabilize a patient. A paramedic...
And can a paramedic on an ambulance and a paramedic on a fire truck both stabilize the patient equally well?
Yes. Yes. So the whole foundation or fundamental of paramedic medicine is taking care to the patient. All of the compact state-of-the-art equipment that's found on the ambulances and our paramedic engines are designed to get this care to the patient, treating the patient where you find the patient, not necessarily wrapping them up and loading them and speeding to the hospital. Paramedic medicine's origin is to take the care of the patient, take the care to the patient. So the rapid, as Pat mentioned, the rapid stabilization of this patient, irrespective of how rapid you can perform your procedures, it still takes time. It takes time to work a cardiac patient up, to start IVs, to put a monitor on, to put oxygen on, to prepare the patient for transportation, contact to the resource or telemetry-based hospital to receive instructions from the doctor. Those things don't happen in 2 or 3 minutes. Those things take time. And in most cases, by the time you're done stabilizing the patient, the ambulance is there. So I'll stop with that point.
Terry Brunner, let's go to you. Now, if they get an ambulance there or if they get a fire truck there and they can stabilize the patient, what difference does it make?
Well, unfortunately, you know, in this whole investigation that we've been doing, and we did it 10 years ago with Peter Carl over Channel 5, we originally did emergency ambulance services right before I got here. The Chicago Tribune won the Pulitzer Prize. Bill Jones and Bill Rechtenwald worked on those ambulances. If you remember, and I think you probably do, Mayor Daley trotted out the whole idea of fire department ambulances as opposed to Commissioner Quinn wanted Cadillacs. He said, you know, if you're going to go out, you ought to go out in style. Well, we're still getting the same sort of PR. Unfortunately, this is like saying the Cubs are a great baseball team, but you know, they have to play the game, and at the end of the game there are scores, and they keep score all year long. So we keep score. Now, 4 to 6 minutes into the game here, you begin to have brain damage. We know that the average time that they're getting there is 6.5 minutes. When this investigation first popped over 10 years ago, the time was 4.5 minutes, and we didn't have enough ambulances, according to Harold Washington's Blue Ribbon Committee. They've never put those ambulances onto the street to build up to the number of calls. What we now have are examples of this is great and that's great, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and we got a great system. But unfortunately, the calls into 9/11 have gone up and up and up, and we're having 50% more calls than we had before, yet we haven't raised the number of ambulances. Your chances of living through a heart attack in the city of Chicago are 2%, according to the University of Chicago study by Dr. Becker. Now, if you think you're going to have a heart attack, the thing to do is to move to Milwaukee, because if you move to Milwaukee, your chances are 8% of survival. In Houston or Los Angeles or Seattle, it's over 10%. So the proof of the pudding is in those stats. People are dying in this town because the ambulances don't get there quick enough.
Dr. Glushak, what's your response to the statistics? And also give us an idea of what the overall plan is to provide medical services, emergency services in Chicago.
Well, I think Mr. Brunner's remarks simply speak to the true complexity of looking at this problem, both the magnitude of the so-called problem and the complexity of the solution. The statistics he refers to are about 10 years old, and much has happened in since that time that is far more complex than the one solution that's being thrown out of adding ambulances.
But are the statistics accurate in terms of other cities have a better response time or better life-saving time if someone has a heart attack?
Oh, well,
are we behind other cities in saving lives?
Well, you asked two questions. Response times is a different question from survival. We have not had the funding or the opportunity to study the actual cardiac arrest survival rates since that 10-year-old study. But what we have studied is the indicators of how well we're doing with that. And through other types of solutions that we have worked on, and of which I emphasize, all need to be brought to bear. We have increased training. We have just finished training the entire fire department, one of the few systems in the country that have done this, in advanced cardiac life support. And we have measured that we have halved the time that it takes to respond to and get a cardiac arrest patient shocked. We have halved that. Now, measuring...
A cardiac arrest patient what?
A cardiac arrest patient who goes into cardiac arrest and their heart fibrillates in an irregular rhythm needs to be shocked quickly. That's integral to survival. We have halved the time that it takes to get that done since we did this study. We learned from it, implemented very important actions that made a difference. Adding ambulances may be part of a solution in some other aspect of the system, but it is so much more complex than that to get the results that you want to see.
Yeah. Well, let me go to you, Mr. Fitzmaurice. What do you make of that when they say that the fire department now has received much more training in something as to say people who've
first
had
of all,
heart
you
attacks.
have an ALS engine that has one paramedic, so now you're
Explain
asking
what ALS is just for a
advanced
minute.
life support. They have the same equipment that we have, but the difference is they have one paramedic. Now you're going to ask him, intubate this patient, start the IV, read the EKG monitor by yourself, defibrillate him by yourself. The EMT can do none of those things. And again, if you look at our on-scene time is 10, 12 minutes. When you hear ambulances being dispatched from Chicago Avenue in Michigan to 77th and Stony Island, when you hear the dispatcher on a daily basis get on the radio and say, is there any available ambulance out there? Can anybody go? You're all I got. Start into this run. That's not acceptable.
So is your basic problem that there are not enough ambulances?
No, there's not enough ambulances going back.
Or is it that one person on a fire truck can't do the same thing as two paramedics can?
Well, we need more ambulances. Going back to the Dr. Zidlow report from Air Hill, Washington, he said we needed to bring the ambulance total up to 59. We only have 56 in the city. There's 3 out at O'Hare, and they never leave O'Hare. The 56 in the city, the response continues to increase, 235,000 calls a year. They said we needed 56 based on 175,000 calls. We're at 235 now, and it continues to increase. There is a big
Trotter,
demand.
Let's get a response to that. I mean, everybody keeps saying we need more ambulances. Why doesn't this make sense?
Well, I think that as Dr. Glushak mentioned, that the situation is a little bit more complex than we're being led to believe. The so-called study and the remarks
That's not that complex. I mean, explain to me why we or don't we need more ambulances?
What we need is to continue to put a paramedic at the side of the patient in need of care as fast as we can possibly do it. Is the only answer to increase the number of ambulances? Absolutely not.
And what is your answer?
Throughout the rest of this country, as Chicago has discovered, you use the resources that you have available to you. If you have a fire engine, we have 99 of them. Once they are completely equipped to become paramedic engines, that's 99 plus the 59 advanced life support ambulances. That's 158. Allow me to finish, please. At 158. For Pat to mention, well, let me address Mr. Brunner's point. He said that the best thing for you to do if you have a heart attack or if you want to call 911 is to move to Milwaukee. That's not only reckless, but that's irresponsible. This system, when you take the statistics and look across the country at what's going on and compare systems to system, compares to LA, don't compares to Evanston, compares to New York, don't compares to Naperville.
And how does Chicago compare?
We are, if not on par, when we are compared to Los Angeles, New York, Houston, Dallas, San Diego, we are superior in run volume. What this so-called investigation brought
now, is that in response time?
In response time, pardon me, I misspoke. In response time. When you take the so-called statistics from this report, what they didn't factor in, they looked at ambulances. They didn't look at someone trained to provide intervention for your situation on the scene within 4 minutes. They for whatever reasons, left that part of it out.
Well,
they were trying to prove a point.
Why didn't you include fire trucks in your survey if they're there
suggest this,
assisting the patient?
We've been accused by the fire department of the city of Chicago of being irresponsible ever since we ran the Mirage Tavern and showed people taking bribes, ever since we talked about the 5 funny flames, ever since we showed these run times. Now, I would agree with the doctor. I think the point he's making is very valid. It's a complex system. Now, if you remember, a couple years ago, we showed you the internal workings of the 911 dispatch system. We showed the people sleeping. I said that the mayor ought to go over there and kick these people in the pants and wake them up. He said Brunner doesn't understand union contracts. I spoke to a lawyer today who makes his living suing people because they've died in these 9/11 cases, and he says his deposition showed that no one has ever been disciplined for all the sleeping that we showed, not only on television nationally, but over in the city council.
So now is your basic concern 911?
No,
let's address 911 for a minute if that's your concern.
911 is an element. The ambulance arrival time is an element. Who's on that ambulance is an element. How well they're trained. It all works together. The proof of the pudding is in something like the Cersei case, when a national thing happens and everybody suddenly looks at the system that Mr. Trotter and others in the fire department are saying it's wonderful, it's great, and now we see what happens. 4 people call up. They don't send an ambulance. Shots fired, person shot in the head, a policeman calls, the father at the party calls, the kid is dying, the ambulance isn't dispatched because the person is incompetent that's taking the phone call.
Dr. Glushak, let's get a response to again, the overall look at the system. And when you look at when it starts with 911, how well are the 911 dispatchers trained if they're the ones that are going to have to decide whether an ambulance goes or a fire truck goes or who responds?
Before I can answer that, I'd like to take a step back and say how one of the reasons I was interested in partaking in this discussion is to try to get a handle on what I think has been a fairly alarmist and hysterical portrayal of what the status of our response capabilities are in the city of Chicago. I'm not saying by any means that there aren't fallout cases, perhaps a significant number of fallout cases of the overall statistics of responses. And from an academic point of view, working in a hospital, I could never go searching for the worst list of cases I could find in a pile of run sheets and say, this is a portrayal of our system. By the same token, as tragic as the few incidents have been portrayed recently in the media and focused on, I can't make a conclusion about how a system is functioning by one terribly tragic case. We've all looked at it in depth. I was just at a hearing to state House of Representatives hearing that discussed this case, and all of the legislators there came away with, we won't change the entire system based on this one tragic case, and make the mistake of overreacting and calling for what on the surface seem to be oversimplistic solutions.
But do you think right now, I mean, the question we asked you in the piece, Mr. Trotter, I mean, do you feel that if your relative was shot or something horrible happened to someone in your family, that response time would be quick enough, that an ambulance, or if a fire truck pulled up, do you think your relative would be treated adequately?
All right. You phrased sort of a three-part question. The last one I'll tell you. My colleagues in EMS, medical directors across the nation, have discussed this topic in depth, and they all are pretty much moving to a cross-train level of dependence on fire engines. And yes, we feel very comfortable that the same paramedics we train to staff the ambulance will be in good hands if they respond on a truck, as long as it's a very temporary initial measure to take.
Well, at this point, we're talking about 18 years for them. They cross-train them at a rate of 10 to 20 years. So 18 years from now, we'll have 100 ALS engines on the street. In the meantime, I talked to the Director of Emergency Medical Service for the union today. We're estimating 30,000 calls a year in excess of 7 to 10 minutes. That's not acceptable. And again, we're not putting down the ALS engine program. It's a great backup system. It's a redundant backup. In my neighborhood, there's an engine 125. But I can tell you this, if my house is on fire right now, I do not want engine 125 sitting at a medical emergency call when an ambulance should be there. I want them putting out the fire. And I've talked to a number of firemen who say this could be problematic when they're going to put out a fire. And they're waiting, where's my engine? It's on an ambulance call.
Mr. Trotter, how much of a problem is that the fire truck should be at a fire when it's responding to an ambulance call?
Well, again, we have 99 engines. We have 99 fire engines and 50 trucks. So the numbers are there. Pat mentions that
to respond to both emergency medical services and fires?
Yes. Yes, there are backup procedures if what's called a change of quarters. If an engine is out of quarters for any length of time for a fire, they move another engine into that house. So it's not just a mere, I would rather have the firefighters putting out my fire and have them available to respond to fires only, as opposed to having them out on this medical emergency. It's interesting, Elizabeth. If I can finish my point, it's interesting that the paramedics, prior to being cross-trained and moving over to the paramedic engines, that many of whom in the past worked with Pat, they were okay and they were fine paramedics at that point to be considered for a frontline treatment of patients. But now that they're not on an ambulance, they're now on an engine, now somehow they become secondary paramedics.
Well,
now they're not as good.
We've never made
they're not as good to respond.
Never made that statement.
That's what you said just now.
They're working by themselves, okay? All these frontline paramedics are excellent, but they always worked with another paramedic, not an EMT. They had someone else to rely on. While I'm intubating the patient, they're starting the IV. When they look at a cardiac monitor, they're saying, what do you see on this monitor, Pat? You know, they're doing other things. There's two paramedics working in conjunction, and we've never made that accusation. But what you have to understand is that any time an ambulance goes from Chicago Avenue, Michigan to 77th and Stony Island, when you hear the dispatcher repeatedly say, is there anybody available in the loop? Can we get an ambulance out here? You're all I have. They're not saying that because of any other reason, and there's a problem with ambulance response time. And I'm not going to go as far as...
But if they have 99 fire trucks,
they only have 20 of them in service now as ALS engines, and
if they could equip enough fire trucks
in 20 years by the standards that they're operating.
Would that satisfy you? Do you think that an adequate response, a fire truck with a paramedic?
That's an adequate backup system. It is a redundant backup. We still need more ambulances.
A backup, or is it?
It's a backup system. We need more ambulances.
Why? Because they can't transport?
They can't transport. There are many instances where it is rapid treatment and transportation. Many instances where we're supposed to just go. In fact, at our last continuing education, the doctors talked about going to the hospital with severe trauma patients. Don't even start an IV. Do your treatment en route.
Now, Dr. Glushak, hasn't there been procedures in Chicago in particular where it says that transport is very important to get the patient immediately to the hospital? And think about that and hold on, because our time is already up. Our many thanks to Patrick Fitzmaurice, Dr. Cal Glushak, Terrence Brunner, and Cortez Trotter for being with us tonight. Now, tomorrow night in the program, join John Callaway for a national political roundtable, including analysis of Vice President Al Gore's visit to Chicago and President Clinton's trip to Russia. That's tomorrow at 7 and 10. I'm Elizabeth Brackett. Thank you, and good night. Dr. Glushak?
Well, that's absolutely right. For certain types of problem, we emphasize rapid transport. That specifically applies in a small segment of very serious trauma cases. But we think that basically you're getting the adequate response you need in terms of response times with a certain statistical fallout, which I don't think any other city has managed to avoid to this point.